It is your money, your vote. In last night's Ohio debate, lots of exchanges like this one on controlling costs.
Let's have a debate about the facts.
The last answer on this topic.
It is just not accurate to say that Senator Clinton does more to control costs than mine. That is not the case. There are many experts who've concluded that she does not.
Yeah, the key primaries in Texas and Ohio just 6 days away, and Hillary may need to score a knockout punch to stay in this race. Julian Epstein is a Democratic strategist who has counseled Hillary. He's also given money to her campaign. And syndicated columnist David Sirotto is the author of the upcoming book, The Uprising. He is a political analyst and a former Democratic strategist. And David, is it fair to say you lean towards Obama?
It's fair to say I lean towards Obama, yes.
Okay, well, let's start things off. Julian, last night, watching what happened with Hillary, I know beforehand you were saying don't count Hillary out. What's your feeling after seeing that debate?
Well, I think she was very effective. I think she went on the offensive on health care, on the credit crisis, and the housing crisis. I think she was good on Iraq. I think she was very strong on all measures. I thought Barack performed well too. Hillary's problem is not how well she performs in the debates. If her campaign was measured by the debates, I think she'd be doing fine. Her problem is what her campaign does, I think, in undermining her in many senses outside of the debates. All of the silliness about plagiarism, the turban exchange, the attacks on Barack being nothing about words, I think come across to voters as being somewhat small-minded and cloud people's view about what the rationale is for her candidacy.
Can you separate the candidate from her campaign staff?
Well, I think that's her problem. I think in many ways her campaign has misserved her in the last couple of weeks, particularly with the attacks on things like plagiarism. Right. And I think it's undermined what has otherwise been very effective performances for her in the debates. And right now, this really comes down to Texas. If she does well in Texas, she buys herself another 7 weeks. If she doesn't lose Texas, there's no real argument for her staying in.
David, what do you think happens in Texas and Ohio?
I think it's going to be really very close. I think the last night's debate, I think Julian's right. I think both candidates did very well. I think the problem for Hillary Clinton in a place like Ohio has been NAFTA, and I thought that exchange with Tim Russert, reading back her quotes on NAFTA, was a devastating moment for her. A recent poll came out this week showing that most voters in Ohio, not surprisingly, are very opposed to NAFTA, and they see Hillary Clinton far more than Barack Obama as responsible for NAFTA. And so I think what Obama's strategy is to try to win Ohio based on a populist message on trade, and move into Pennsylvania with the same message. It was a message that worked for him in Wisconsin, and I think it's a message that's working for him now.
How do you do that, though, and win Texas, where free trade is obviously a lot more popular?
No, see, that's the thing. I think people have the perception outside of Texas that NAFTA is this wonderful, great thing for Texas, and I don't think it pops in that way in Texas. In fact, I think there's been a lot of opposition, in fact, recently to NAFTA because of the perception of a NAFTA superhighway, which is not really what's out there, but it's the Trans-Texas corridor.
Julian, who do you think, which candidate has a better shot of winning in a general election against John McCain?
I think it's very, very early to tell. I think Hillary does have a good argument in the sense that every negative argument that you can make against her has been made. So when she says she's been vetted, we know all of the kind of slime tactics Republicans could use against her, and her negatives have hit about as high as they're going to hit. I think with Barack, who's ahead in most of the matchup polls right now, the problem there is that nobody's really ever he's never really had to run against a very strong Republican machine. So you don't know what happens when the Republicans go on the negative, when they go after his voting record, for example, in the state Senate, where he was very liberal on many social issues. I think he's very effective in answering those questions. I think he's about as effective as anybody else in answering negative questions out there, but it's very, very hard to measure right now because Barack just hasn't had that experience.
You know, one of the things that doesn't seem to get in the news as often as it might is the fact that Hillary, by every measure, has a very low likability index. On the other hand, Obama has just the opposite. So almost independent of what they say, and a lot of the comments they said about NAFTA last night were outright ridiculous, I think that it's going to fall in favor of the likability index. What do you people think about that?
Julian, why don't you take that? You've given money to the Hillary campaign.
Well, I think Barack is an enormously likable person, not just for Democrats, but independents and a lot of Republicans. And I think there is no question he has a bit of an edge on that. I think that I think that Hillary's likability amongst Democrats and independents is high. I'd slightly disagree with that question. I think the negatives run high. If you look at the polls, the negatives are very high with some independents and a lot of Republicans. So I'm not sure that's too big of a liability in the general election, but I do agree that Barack is a phenom in the sense of his crossover likability.
Yeah, and when you were talking about the campaign and casting some of the blame on them, I thought one of the most telling things, it was either Penn or Wolfson said, you know, we're a little bit frustrated trying to run against the phenomenon, and that sums it up right there. I mean, by the time they came out with the plagiarism and maybe some of the, you know, shame on you, some of these other things that they've been trying, they had already sort of run into a wall with this guy who is, he's a phenomenon.
Well, but they made it worse for themselves with that stuff.
Well, what would you do at that point? You can't just sit there and just let this phenomenon.
I don't want to dominate the time because David has a lot of great things to say. I'm a big fan of David's too. But what I would say is, look, I've got a much better plan on health care. Let me tell you why it is.
That gets so wonky, though. I watched the last one.
I don't think you have to get down into Wonkville. I think you're related to people. That's what it was in the last debate. That's a communications challenge. That's a communications challenge. I think you can go and you can distinguish. Hillary can distinguish her position on health care. She has a good argument on Iraq if she were to make it, which I don't think she's made it effectively enough. She's got an excellent argument on the housing crisis. And I think she has to say, look, I've got a much better plan. The problem with Barack Obama is he capitulates too much.
Well, but David...
And I don't think she's made that argument. I think his basic argument has been political reform, which is a very appealing argument.
Well, David, I mean, everyone loves to second guess and go into hindsight, but wouldn't you argue that if you had built a strategy going into Iowa that wasn't based on this aura of inevitability, you wouldn't have to be resorting to things like turbines and Xerox now, right?
I absolutely agree. She's running a sort of an old-style campaign where she's trying to pick him apart with 1,000 cuts, and he's running a more thematic campaign. And to the question of who I think is better suited against John McCain, look, there's two issues here that I think John McCain now is most vulnerable on. Obviously, the Iraq War, with his comment that we're going to be there for 100 years, that's completely out of step with where the American public is. And this issue with lobbyists and special interest influence, the Washington Post story last week about how lobbyists are running his campaign. Barack Obama, one of the strongest issues has been, as Julian said, political reform and basically cracking down on the influence of lobbyists on politicians. And so I think Obama, on those two issues in particular, which are John McCain's biggest weaknesses, is where Barack Obama's electability argument in a general election really flies.
But here's Hillary's strategy right now. Hillary's strategy is that I think she's going to win Ohio. She's sufficiently ahead in the polls. If she can win Texas, that buys her 7 weeks. And then I think the strategy after that is that the media begins to ask Barack Obama some pretty tough questions. Right. I mean, I think people can ask tough questions about the influence, the special interest influence, maybe not of lobbyists, but certainly of donations that are going into his campaign. I think they can ask all kinds of tough questions about that, about his positions on a host of issues that he hasn't been challenged on, and that may begin to change the race to some extent. But she's going to need to buy those 7 weeks.
We got to get through the fourth first. Gentlemen, thanks. Good to see you. Julian and David, thanks for that.
Thanks for having us.
A lot of news.